Well, good morning, gentlemen. You guys look bright and alert. You ready to go? Take that first step that Bill's been talking about. That's what we want to do this morning. Last week we looked at a broad but balanced overview of authentic manhood. And we said authentic manhood is expressed in four faces. Do you remember those last week? We talked about the king face. The face of the king that you see in a man who expresses nobility and righteousness and integrity in his life. We talked about the face of the warrior, the face of power, of perseverance, of strength. We talked about that you see in the man a face of a lover, tenderness, sensitivity, romance, and then finally the face of the friend, the one who exhibited transparency and trust and accountability. Those, in a sense, are the four broad faces of authentic manhood. It kind of gave us a first look at what a real man looks like. And I shared those with you because it gives us a first pass, but it also begins to offer to us at least one of the promises that I made to you at the very beginning. That would be that we were going to be developing a manhood language together. And I think even in mentioning those four faces, we get the first, in a sense, seed form of that language, because you can go out now just with those four faces and you can see a guy and you can say, you know, that guy lacks a strong king in his life. If I said that to you, you would know exactly what I meant, wouldn't you? Or I could say that in looking at another fellow, I can say, you know, he has a weak warrior in him. What I mean by that, immediately you would pick up on that. You would know he doesn't have this kind of inner passion to push him over the top. He's not a conqueror. You may say to one guy, he's got a strong friend face, and to another, his friend face is more of a user than a friend. You'd know exactly what I meant. That's kind of the beginning of what I call a manhood language. Now, over the course of the year, we will build on that language, and that language begins to connect us together as men, soul to soul. Because we can begin to speak about more things than just sports and our golf game and our new car and those kind of things. We can speak at a soul level as men, and it's very important that men have a manhood language to talk with one another about. Now, when you came in here with your notes, you received this manhood plan, and I want you just to look at it just for a moment. I want to put some dates on your manhood plan. Because here at the beginning of the year, you need to see this, because this is how we're going to finish the year. When we finish the year, if you stick with us through the whole year, which I hope that you do, the great moment is going to be when you can share your plan with the other men in your group, and you can also give this plan to me, which is a requirement for graduation. It's the only thing I'm going to ask you to do, but it is a profound instrument if you will do it. There are really three parts to this plan. As you open it up, the very first part you're going to see is a plan that says to look back. And that's what we're going to be covering through the fall together. And if you would, you just might jot down, you need to finish this look back by December, by the first week in December. The way you finish this part is I want you to follow the outline just as it's there. I want you to answer those questions and think deeply about looking back. Now, right now, a lot of those questions may not make real good sense to you, and that's okay. As we go through, all the questions will become clear. But these questions will take you where you need to go to look back, which we'll take the first step on today. Then we'll look at now, starting in January. And as we look at now, there are some questions about where you are now. I want you to follow those questions exactly as well. And you need to have that finished by March 1st. So you might just jot down March 1st there. And then finally, a look ahead. And we'll be doing that in March and April, and you're going to need to have that finished by April the 1st so that you can turn it in as we finish men's fraternity together. And that look ahead there at the end, that'll also take you back to the very first page, which says, when you're really finished. And there's a little tombstone there. And all that you've done, looking back, looking at now, and looking ahead, you're going to summarize that on that little tombstone, because we need to live our lives with the end in mind. I like the little verse on the front of the manhood plan that says, teach us to number our days that we might present to Thee a heart of wisdom. Basically, you can summarize that up by saying men need to live their lives with the end in mind. So what I want to do for you with this manhood plan is I want you to think deeply about where you've been, give you a moment to do that through the fall, then think deeply about where you are now. We'll do that January, February, and part of March. And then I want you to think deeply about where you're going and how you want to finish your life. Real men have a plan. The unauthentic man or the unhealthy man has no plan. He lives in the immediate. He lives in the now. He just reacts to life. And that's why he doesn't go anywhere. But real men have a plan. So I want to give you the opportunity to do that, then to finish that, and then leave men's fraternity with a clear outline or framework for you, personalized by you, of the kind of man that you want to be and want to become. And that's what the manhood plan is all about. Now, this morning we're in session 3. And here in session 3, we want to take what I consider to be the first step in authentic manhood. And the first step to me in authentic manhood is in looking back. Real men have to look back in their life. Some of you remember years ago when the Olympic Games used to feature a little segment called Up Close and Personal. How many of you remember that? The Up Close and Personal segment. I mean, here would be this great Olympic athlete about to ski, about to go off one of the giant runs like the giant slalom. And just as he gets up there and gets his skis over the edge, they would have a flashback. And that flashback would take you back to his home in Switzerland or in Austria or in America, and you would get to see all the events in just a small summary form of this man's life that brought him to this incredible moment. And what you discovered is that these great Olympic athletes didn't get there just by accident or happenstance, or even because they were naturally great athletes. There was a series of events and a series of decisions, personal decisions, and sometimes coincidences that you would just be amazed at, that brought them to this incredible place where they got to perform on a world stage. You learned how they got to be what they are from their past. I remember my daughter swam for an AAU team here in Little Rock called the Little Rock Dolphins. And during those years that she swam, we had to get up at 5 in the morning to get her in the pool by 5:30 to swim for a couple of hours. And we thought that was making a big sacrifice. But there was a young man named John who was growing up an hour and a half from Little Rock, who would get up every morning at 3, and his parents would drive him to Little Rock to swim at 5:30 and then take him back to Clinton, Arkansas so he could go to school. And we followed that all the way through grade school while she swam and with John and into junior high. And it was just an incredible story of perseverance and courage and discipline and hard work. In fact, it was so hard that when my daughter got to high school, she gave swimming up. But John continued to persevere. And you know, years later, I sat in front of my television set and I watched John Hargis line up in a pool in Atlanta and win the gold medal for the U.S. Everybody has a story. Everybody in this room is who they have become because of events in your past and decisions you made and circumstances that came in, sometimes that you had nothing to do with, but all of those became a mixture that created you to become the kind of person that you are today. But there's a problem with the past. And the problem is this: most of us don't really know our own story. We know parts of our story. We like to tell, in fact, the best parts. But none of us, or maybe I should say many of us, have not taken the time to really think through our past and analyze our past in a way that explains us to us, where we really understand why we are the way we are and why we do the things the way that we do them. And without this kind of understanding, we cannot change the things that need to be changed in order to grasp the authentic manhood that we were meant to live. We need to understand ourselves. Everybody has a story. And if you don't understand your story in a way that makes a difference in the way you live now, then what I find in so many men is that instead they're driven by themes and forces they don't understand, or themes and forces they're not willing to face, they've buried in their life, or they misunderstand that rob them of the authentic manhood that they were meant to live. Do you know your story? Do you know why you are the way you are? And why you do what you do? Have you explained you to you? It's the first step in authentic manhood. That's why we have the saying that's endured through time that says this: the unexamined life is not worth living. Everyone needs to know why they are the way they are. Well, rather than saying more about the importance of looking back, I thought maybe this morning, since so many of you are new to this setting and new to me, and I'm new to you and you don't really know me, I thought I would model the very thing that I'm saying here today by taking you back and just kind of telling you my story. It'll help introduce me to you in a more up-close and personal way, but it'll also help you understand the speaker who stands in front of you this week a little more intimately. And I think that's important in the journey that we're going to go on together. For starters, let me just tell you that I grew up in a 1950s family. And we were somewhat the typical family, except maybe in two ways. Both of my parents worked. And in the 1950s, that was different because most moms stayed home. But most of my parents both worked. And what we had to have because of that is we had to have someone to come in to us three boys and take care of us. So I kind of grew up in daycare in the 1950s. I tell people I grew up in the modern family before it was modern. Second thing that was kind of unique about our home in the 1950s was that we were really a non-church going family in a small southern town. And that was different because most everybody else went to church. When Sunday came around, we rolled over rather than get up and get dressed and go to a local church. Now, we were on the rolls of a local church. I remember, in fact, one time, this was only happened one time, but I remember when the Methodist minister came to call on my family. Being a family that really didn't go to church much, I remember when the pastor came in and sat down with my folks and us, I remember how foreign that felt. It really was strange. And I can remember when he finally said goodbye and walked out the door, my mom shut the door and leaned up against it and just went, she was just glad that was over. It was like we were in two different universes at that moment. And now looking back on it, I think, it was kind of strange that I never saw my parents pray, ever, at a meal or anything. We never had one serious spiritual discussion of any kind all the years that I lived at home. And that affected me, had an impact on my life. But those were kind of the two of the general distinctions of growing up in the 50s. But with that said, let me introduce you to my family for just a moment. I want to introduce you first to my dad. My dad's name was Thomas Charles Lewis, and he grew up in a well-to-do family in Ruston, Louisiana. His dad was a successful businessman. He was the owner of the local paper there and editor of the Ruston Daily Leader. And because of that, my dad had things that a lot of other young men didn't, and I think he used those to play a lot. At least that's kind of the reputation he had as a young man growing up. In fact, when he was in his early 20s, he took off and went and lived in Southern California. Later, when the war started, my dad joined the U.S. Army and went and fought in France, and he was a proud United States veteran of the war. And after the war, he came back to Louisiana and settled in Ruston and became an insurance agent. That's what he did for a living. Then there was my mom, Lily Ethel Taylor Lewis. They called her Billy. She was the daughter of a farmer, lived in Farmersville, as a matter of fact, Farmersville, Louisiana. And she was the youngest of 10 children. My mom was a very strong-willed, determined, ambitious woman. And I think that's why, rather than being a homemaker, she was a working woman. She became an office manager of a fairly large legal firm. She was the personal assistant to a lawyer who became the lieutenant governor of the state of Louisiana. And then later, after he passed on and his son became head of the firm, he became a state senator, and she worked for that firm for 38 years. Then there was my older brother, Charles, who was 4 years older than me. Charles was a really smart individual, a guy who was very talented, especially in art. And when he graduated from college, he was trying to get entrance into the Los Angeles School of Art. He was very talented in that regard, but it was also at the height of the Vietnam War. And because of that, and because his number was one of the first drawn, he had to instead put off that career and then enter into the Navy, and he became an interpreter in the Navy. And then that changed his whole career, because while he was in the Navy, he decided art wasn't the way to go, so he later ended up a lawyer in Houston, Texas, guys. Then there was my younger brother, John, who was 2 years younger than me. John was kind of the easygoing, fun-loving, musically talented guy in the family. And then there was me, the not-so-smart but very energetic kid who loves sports and loves them to this day. For 17 years, as you look at those 5 individuals, we were pressed together for 17 years in a small white brick house at 308 South Bonner Street there in Ruston, Louisiana. And just like you, though your family picture may look a lot different than mine, but just like you, those formative years were formative. The experiences there, the moments there, the influences there help shape, in a large part, the kind of person that you see standing in front of you today. In fact, I want to just share with you some moments that shaped my life, and then we'll summarize it and I'll apply it to you. First of all, I'd say there were some good moments from our family. You know, I felt generally supported by my parents growing up. My parents came to my ball games. My parents were the kind of people who would show up at school events, especially my mom. She got involved in those school events, and I felt her support there. Our home was always open to my friends, and because I was kind of a leader type, I was always bringing large numbers of guys over to her house. My mom loved them to come over and cook for them, and provided a place where it was fun to be at my house. So I felt generally supported all the way growing up. I have great memories of our annual Florida vacation. Every year when summer came, the big event for our family was all to load up in the back of our Rambler with no air conditioning, which I could have done without. And pressed together, we would drive from Louisiana down to Pensacola and spend a week or two at the beach. A few times my dad took my brother and I fishing. You know, it's interesting, I can remember every one of those fishing events in detail. 4 or 5 times we went fishing, just my brother John and I and Dad. And looking back on those moments, I would say that was the best of Dad. Those moments where there was no agenda, just me and Dad together for a whole day of pure joy to a little kid. And remembering back on those moments, I learned something, and I learned how much a son's soul craves the best of Dad and just to be with Dad in those kind of moments. There were also noble moments, not just good moments, but noble moments in our family. The way my mom took care of her aging parents, that taught me a lot about loyalty to family. The way my dad would get up every Veterans Day at 3 a.m. and go out and put flags on every veteran's grave. He was known for that. Even when he became very aged and his health had been robbed from him, the one thing he would relentlessly do is get up on Veterans Day and go out and put those little flags by every grave to honor those men. I also remember that my dad taught me a lot about human dignity. Remember, both my parents worked, and so we had to have people come in and take care of us. One of the individuals that my dad enlisted to take care of us was an African-American kid named James Jones. And I don't know how my dad connected with him. I never will figure that out. But he picked this young man out and brought him into our home. And at night, he would, in the afternoons and evenings, a lot of times, he would stay with us. And my dad had a real special relationship with James. And I can remember when I was about 10, starting to get a little rambunctious one night. James was trying to put us to bed, and I didn't want to go to bed, and I got mad. I got furious. Now, remember, it's the 50s. And I remember James saying, "You got to go to bed." And I looked at him and I said, "Nigger." James grabbed me and threw me over his leg and gave me a good swat on the rear, put me in the bed. And as he was putting me in the bed, I said, "I'm going to tell my dad that you hit me." And I can remember there was a little fear in his eyes. And as soon as my dad came in, I jumped up and came running there and said, Daddy, James hit me." And I remember James standing behind me, and he said, "Mr. Lewis, Robert called me a nigger." And the next thing I knew, I was flying through the air. Landed over my dad's knee, and I got the spanking of my life. And he pulled me up after that, and he said, "Never, ever use those words again." And I learned a lot about human dignity. You know what? I think James learned a lot too. James was the first person in his family to ever graduate from college. Did so because of that special bond that my dad had with him all those years in that small southern town. But there were noble moments in our family. There were also missed moments. There was no critical life instruction from my mom and dad. You know, it's interesting, growing up and being around them all the time, there were so many missed moments concerning just basic life skills. Never had a discussion with my dad about girls. He never told me about money or cars or manhood or how a man looks or acts. And so I always felt a certain sense that I had to do it alone. Maybe you had that feeling growing up. In fact, I remember my senior year when I was being recruited by Tennessee and Arkansas and LSU and Ole Miss, and all these schools were calling, especially my home school, LSU, putting all this pressure on me. The coaches were flying up to meet with me and talk with me, and the governor was calling me on the phone saying I had to sign with LSU, and I was so confused. At 17, I looked at my dad, I said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Hey, it's up to you." And I wanted somebody, it was up to me, but I wanted somebody to process life with me. And because I had no one to process with, I made a lot of mistakes. And in making a lot of mistakes, it made me at times an angry person, because when I left home at 17, I left clueless about life. There was also no emotional closeness, especially from my dad. You know, I never heard my dad say, "I love you." I never heard my dad say, "I'm proud of you." Now, Dad was around, but it was funny. He felt close and strangely distant at the same time. And for a young guy growing up, 14, 15, 16, that's hard to put together. When your dad feels like he's real close but real distant. And yet that was always our relationship. We had these missed moments. There were also hurtful moments. Probably the most hurtful moment was around alcohol that my dad increasingly gave himself to as I moved into my teenage years. It was also kind of the key issue that began to unravel my mom and dad's marriage in the process, because they were constantly at odds with one another, bickering, fighting, nagging one another. And we three kids running around in that home and then getting bigger through the years, we're kind of caught in the middle of this war. And in some strange way, we're invited in to help manage it. Now, my two other brothers, my older brother, he just begged off. My younger brother just went passive. And for whatever reason, maybe it's just because of my personality, but again, these are the events that shape a life. I felt like I had to be the negotiator. So I got enlisted into the war as the negotiator between mom and dad. And I remember trying to do that at 14 and 15 and 16 and 17 and 18, trying to bring peace to our home. And I made both of them mad at me. And you know, it's tough to be a teenager and be managing your home and your parents. But that's where I found myself. And you know, you swallow a lot of pain when you're starting to take care of your parents when they should be taking care of you. And you also swallow a lot of shame. I remember one day my dad asked me to go down and pick up a couple of tools from a hardware store. We only had one in Ruston. And I went down because he was working on a table that he was putting together. There were a group of guys in this hardware store. And I went in and I was asking for the stuff that my dad asked me to buy. And they said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, my dad's building a table. And one of the guys turned to a couple of the other guys standing there and said, yeah, Tommy Lewis doesn't know much about, building stuff, but he sure knows a lot about alcohol. And everybody had this big laugh. And there I am standing with my little tools in my hand. And inside, I'm dying. Because I felt nothing but just a massive amount of shame that I didn't know what to do with. There were also defining moments. Probably the defining moment occurred after I left home, but it had been occurring all the way through my years at home. It was at my wedding. You see a picture of my wedding there, and there's my brothers to the right, and there is my wife's parents to the left. Notice my wife's dad. He doesn't look real excited about who she's marrying at the moment. He looks pretty stiff there. And then there's my mom over to my left. And you're probably wondering what I was wondering that day. Where's my dad? When I showed up at my wedding, my dad didn't show up. Later, I found out he was so drunk, he couldn't get out of bed. And I remember driving off with my new bride out of Ruston to our honeymoon. As we passed that city limit sign, I said to myself, I'm going to be better than that. And it became one of the defining themes of my life. I'm going to be better than that. You see, everybody has a story. Every guy in here has a story. Your story is different than mine, but in some ways it's probably similar to mine. Everybody is who they have become because of moments like that. Noble moments, missed moments, hurtful moments, defining moments. You are who you are in part because of those things. But do you understand those things? And maybe the bigger question, do you understand how those things are impacting your life right now?